Hello, this is Ali Bahabadi and he is Mr. Milo. In this video, we will talk about the process of this digital painting, focusing on painting fur. I work with Krita, but there really isn't much difference between the softwares, Krita, Photoshop, or any other software. Which you will see is just one method from several methods we can paint digitally. We start our work with drawing. And in the first stage, we only focus on the general proportions and the correct drawing of the volume and shapes. And we do not get too involved in details. Well, the initial drawing is almost complete. Now, we work a little on the overall composition. For example, I make it a little bigger and try to keep the eyes on the third line. So that we can get an acceptable composition. We reduce the opacity of the initial drawing layer and create a new layer on it. And this time we draw with a little more detail. For example, wherever necessary, we show the direction of the hair, or I will work more carefully on the edges. But again, we don't get too involved in the details. As you can see, we have some volumes that are made with hair groups. We specify this to some extent because when we'll paint the details in the next steps, we may lose the overall volume. It's better to spend more time at this stage and specify these volumes as much as we can. I can say that the drawing is almost finished and only needs a little cleaning. And gradually we enter the coloring stage in our painting. For this, I create a new layer under the drawing layers and put the general color of the subject on it. By the general color, I mean, for example, Milo is an orange-brown dog with an almost white chest and belly. We place this color on this layer regardless of the effect they get from light or shadow. First, we put a flat color. We paint everywhere, we even paint the eyes and later put other colors on this layer. As you can see, I'm not very precise on the edges now, but the edges are very important in this stage, so I'll correct the edges with the eraser tool. I don't know if you have noticed or not, but Krita has an interesting feature. Whatever brush you are using, by pressing the E key, the same brush will turn into an eraser. I have the E key defined on my pen and switch between the eraser and the main brush very quickly whenever needed. For example, here on this edge, some places should be erased and some places should be added color. I try to show the general feeling of hair and fur on the edges. It's almost good now. I will improve the edges again. At this stage, we are not going to paint individual hairs. In fact, I will show the feeling of the hairs and fur on the edge by drawing the groups of hair. Look, by pressing the E key on my pen, I switch between the brush and the eraser. Sometimes I erase the extra colors and sometimes I add a new color. I'm almost satisfied with the edges. We can lock the brush from here, so we can only work in the area where there is color. This is another good feature of Krita, which of course exists in Photoshop with a little difference and probably in other digital painting software. Similar to the selection. This can be done with layer in Photoshop, but in Krita, this feature is applied to the brush. If you are more comfortable, you can select the whole layer. And if we want to put the color in another layer, we have to do the same thing. Now we add other colors. For example, it has a warmer color here, or the fur is white in some places, or the eyes and lips are dark, regardless of the light and shade. We put the colors on this layer. I have set the drying layers mode to multiply so that they show themselves darker on dark colors. These parts are almost white, but not completely white. A very light gray and a little warm. On the other hand, we are going to add highlights on them later, so the perfect white color is not suitable here. We put black on the nose and lips. I add darkness around the muzzle without affecting the light or shadow. For example, we are not supposed to say that this part of the lip is darker because it is in the shadow, or that this is lighter because the light shines on it. I put the color of the eyes completely flat, but to be a little more comfortable, it means that I can look into his eyes more easily. I also paint the reflection of light in his eyes. It is not really necessary at this point, but I feel better this way. The overall color of our work is completed, and we have a completely flat image. Now we go to the background. I paint the background in 2 layers. A flat color, I think a very dark blue is a good choice. This is good. Or on another layer with usually textured and large brushes, I put variations of the same main color on it, colors close to the main color. The background is somewhat satisfactory, and from now we will add volume to our painting. Save. Create a multiple layer above the general color layer to paint shadows on it. I guess you are familiar with the operation of multiplayer mode. In simple words, any color that appears on the multiply layer is added to the colors of the layer below. Now, with a light and slightly cold gray, we show the parts that are in the shadow. I hold the Ctrl key and click on the main color layer to select its borders, so that we can continue our work without stressing that the shades will affect the background. Those smaller groups of hair, especially where they are between the border of shadow and light, and they have shadows that we paint here as well. And because we spent time on them during the drawing phase, our work here is easier and more accurate. Now, by adding another multiply layer, we will give more dimension to our painting. On this layer, we paint the shadows that are in the shadows with the same color that we use for the bottom layer. We add some details to our work. For example, we paint the shadow under this group of hair, or we add the shadow of the corner of the eye, or it needs more shade under the chin and jaw. Little by little, the volume of our painting shows itself, and it is out of the flat state. Now, it's time for lighting. We create an overlay layer, and with a warm light color, I will add a little highlight to our work. I will highlight both the overall volume and occasionally some details. Well, now that we have shown the volume of our painting with shadows and light, we will enter a slightly more painterly stage. We create a layer above all layers with normal mode, that is even above the layer of the initial drawing, and we start painting the details by manually selecting the color or using the color picker. Wherever necessary, we put a lighter color on the work, and in some places we put a darker color. We don't need this selection anymore because we want to improve the edges and get closer to general feeling of hair and fur. Again, we don't have much to do with individual hairs. For example, here I am painting white hair groups with a completely white color. In showing the texture, for example, we want to show the soft texture of the fur. In the induction of the texture, one of the important places to focus on is the edges. Here, by showing a little detail on the edges, we can show off the furry texture of our subject much better. During this painting, notice that I work more carefully on the edges in different places. Some places, especially in the shadows, I have put colors that sometimes create very sharp lines, and that I have to blend them out with a blending tool. Also, from now, wherever I feel the lines of the original drawings are no longer needed, I also destroy them with a blender tool. I prefer to work with the blender tool to create a shadow for us as well. We are not going to paint all the details, but in some places of our work, which are more important and the audience's eye moves towards it more, we need to show more details, as we showed more detail on the edges. For example, here, the eyes are the main center of attention. So during this painting, you can see that I paint around the eyes more carefully. Look again. At the edge of the head, showing short hair, and compare it with the long hair and that is below the ear, you can see the importance of the edges on the texture induction. Another important part in showing the texture is the part where the shadows and the lights meet, where some of the hair get light in the shadows. For example, it is close to the eye, which means it is an important part of the painting, and since it is located in the semi-shaded area, it is worth spending time on it. But a little to the other side or this side of it does not need so much detail. Throughout this painting, we usually don't paint individual hairs, but we paint groups of hair. And then we add highlights and shadows to it and give it texture by adding a little detail. There are also some hairs, for example, on the inside of his ear. The hairs are in the dark, but their upper part is illuminated. By painting this, we can make our work more attractive. I tried to show the texture on the nose, but I'm not very satisfied. Instead of erasing it, I used the blender tool so that it can show the light on the nose. I will add the texture later. Again, it is close to the important part of the painting, and it is in the range between the lights and shadows, so it is good to spend more time on it. Here, by choosing a slightly lighter color, I paint the lower jaw and show the texture of its short hair, and also show the reflected light that illuminated the lower jaw. Here too, even though it is in the shade, because it is close to the eye and attracts more attention, I will add some details to it. Otherwise, in general, we can distinguish fewer details in the shadows. I think now it is the time to show the spherical shape of the eyes and improve the highlights a little. I want to make our work a little more contrast. In fact, I want to create a shadow layer above all layers. For this, maybe we can use the shadow layer we already had. I will duplicate it and bring it up. Then whenever it needs, I will edit it. Of course, it's not very ideal and needs to be edited. We will edit it a little with the eraser. I think it is better to delete this layer and create a new layer and add shadows wherever needed. When we put our work in more shadows, I think we have created more attractive lighting, and we don't need to go into details because, as I said, details are less visible in the darkness. I think we can apply this shadow layer to the background as well. Places like the lower jaw and under the jaw are completely in the shade. We paint them, and of course, we pay attention to the groups of hair and the direction of hair growth, and the hair that may be partially exposed to the light in the shadow. I think we don't need the drying layer anymore, so I will blur it wherever I see it, and it helps our work in same places which I naturally keep it. I create an overlay layer to make the parts that have been lighted even brighter. I choose a bright, warm color, and without fear of losing the details of the layers below, I can continue my work in some places. They come on the background to give a sense of glow or to show this hair that has been exposed to more light. I want to shine some cold light in the shadows, as if a soft blue light is shining from behind his head. It shows itself mostly in the white parts. I think we can use an airbrush with a slightly larger size to affect more surfaces with light. I will delete the extra parts later. Now I use a smaller brush as an eraser for the parts that I don't want the blue light to shine on. Again, I add a little shadow on the previous multiply layer with a darker gray color. I also use an eraser here and show that the tip of this group of hair is also slightly lightened. In this step, sometimes I work on the shadow layer that has the multiply mode, and sometimes I work on the on the highlights layer that has the overlay mode. Sometimes I erase and sometimes I add color. In the layer that has normal mode, I add some details. For example, I add some individual hairs that are illuminated in the shadows. Or for example, here are some hairs that come from another group of hair and are attached to another group, like this. I erase the places that are in the dark. Or in the groups of hair that have come out of the darkness and their tips have been exposed to light, which we have already mentioned. This show themselves more in the dark parts. We can do the same thing on an overlay layer. I create an overlay layer under the shadows layer to add this detail with the same relatively white color. But they will be affected by the upper multiply layer and appear darker. In this case, I don't need to change colors frequently when they come from light parts to dark parts. In the same way, I add a little to the details next to the eyes. Again, the important part of the edges. I add some small groups of hair to it. I sometimes work on the details of the bright parts in the normal layer that is above all, and sometimes I work on the overlay layer that is below. In fact, I do not have a very specific plan for this process, and I almost is sensory and experimental way I will continue my work. I think these lines from the initial drawing layer on the nose don't help us much, so I will erase them. I think this is one of those places that are worth spending more time on and painting a little more detail because it is close to the eye and is located on the border between lights and shadows. When there is detail here, somehow the whole work is seen in detail. I also complete the nose. I paint the darkness of the lips and show the texture of the hair with an eraser. Again, I spend time on the edge between white hair and black lips. Until we don't forget, we also paint the whiskers in a separate normal layer with black color on top of all layers. Naturally, some part of the whiskers are also lighted. I choose the airbrush, lock it, and add a white color to the lighted places on the whiskers. I do a little trial and error to achieve what I want. connection points of the whiskers need shadows. We don't need to go into too much detail. Let's go again to hairs and groups of hair that have come out of the dark and their tips have been illuminated, especially in the area where light and shadow meet. There you can see more of these hairs. And those individual hairs, and most of them, the small groups of hair. In the very light parts, I add a little darkness based on the direction of the hair groups. I also use the blender tool. In fact, I create shadows in places where I can later paint individual hairs with white color. I want to work on the edge again. For this purpose, I create a layer above the background layer and below the main color layer, and display some hairs with white color. That is the hairs that come from the back and their tip can be seen. Maybe it is necessary to erase some places and add individual hair again. For some of them, only the tips have been exposed. I think we need to work a little on the background. I feel it has high saturation. Let's slightly increase or decrease the saturation on a filter layer. Nope. I think I'll get a better result if I work manually. I'll create a multiply layer and make my work a little warmer. I'll play with the colors a little and erase where necessary. I think it's better to put this part in the shade, a slightly purple shade, will have a little effect on the whites. I use a large texture brush and apply this color to the background. Make the face a little warmer, make it a little yellow. In fact, I am correcting my mistakes. The highlights on the face should not be so white. Now the places where we have lost the whites, for example, the light in the eyes or the whiteness of the muzzle, we erase these places and reveal the whiteness from under this yellow layer. I think it is completely white here. Maybe it can be made a little darker here. Maybe the texture of the fur can be displayed in this part. I think no, there is no need. In my opinion, the work can be considered finished. It wasn't so bad. It's not so bad for an educational work. I'm sure you can do it better than me, but it's not too bad. I think if it has a problem, it is that it could be less detailed in some places. I hope that showing the process of this painting was useful for you and will help you to paint better digital or even traditional paintings. Thank you for watching my video, and I will be very happy if you have any suggestion. Write me in the comments. If you like this type of video, please subscribe to my channel. I'm Ali Bahabadi, and I wish you success.